it's Margaret Buj, and welcome to Unfiltered Career Talks with Margaret Buj series. Today I am with Christine Ong, who's leading talent and media at Quantum Motion. And we're going to talk about how to get a job in tech as a non-techie. So Christine and I actually worked together. We met in a B2B SaaS company 8 years ago, almost 8 years ago at Yieldify. So we've known each other for quite a few years. And Christine, do you want to just give us a quick background of your experience in tech, which I think has been 10 years or so?
Yeah, thanks for having me, firstly, Margaret. So hi, I'm Christine. I'm currently at a quantum computing startup called Quantum Motion. So my background actually before tech, I was an executive assistant in banks. I actually studied psychology, so very non-techie. And I suppose as I was doing my master's, I needed to work and pay the bills. So I ended up in recruiting, but I had a passion in technology, which I suppose never faded. One thing led to another. And we met at Yieldify. And I've been in tech recruitment for about 8 years. So that's got to where I am today. So I thought I'd like to share some insights if you don't come up from a traditional tech background on how to land a role in tech.
Absolutely. So before we even talk about the roles available in tech, when you look at the news, it's kind of all doom and gloom and companies laying people off. So are there even jobs in tech available right now?
Yeah, no, I completely appreciate that. And exactly, I think looking at layoffs.fyi tracker just today in 2023 alone, and what are we, 23rd of February? There's already been 394 tech companies making over 108,000 layoffs. And this is across the entire world. The answer to that is yes. I think, what we're hearing now is actually big companies. I think usually when you hear startups who grow really quickly that make layoffs, you're kind of like, okay, maybe they overprojected. But now what we're seeing is the big tech companies like your Googles and your Metas and Amazons who are making cuts. I think that's when the market starts to get a bit scared, like, okay, can I even get a job there? But I think the reality is a lot of companies overhired 3 or 4 years ago. So they overprojected the amount of talent that they needed for the product roadmap. So actually what's better for the big tech companies is to have a leaner team so they don't have all the overhead of so many engineers to build a leaner product. But that is good news for a lot of other smaller companies who we don't hear about in the news because there's very much still a lot of companies that are hiring, which are startups and SMEs. And actually it's a good thing now we have all this talent in the market because we don't have to compete with the big tech companies. So there's very much still lots of companies hiring at the moment.
Absolutely. I still see loads of companies hiring. I guess it's just a bit more competitive for some positions. I think what's changed, like obviously a lot of people in talent, in recruitment have been let go, and also engineers recently, which typically wasn't the case. But from what I've heard, most people who were let go, they find a new job within 3 months.
Yeah, exactly.
That's actually pretty amazing. So that's great. So when you think of tech, because when people think of tech, they think of coding and engineers, and of course that's a big part of that. But what other jobs are available in tech?
Yeah, and I think that's always the first thing. Even my dad always asks me, "How are you in tech? You're not a coder." But like we work in talent, for example, right? If we want to look at it from a product perspective, and I think hopefully this aligns to those of you out there who are listening who. Let's say you're really obsessed with mobile apps, you love using all the apps on your phone, and you decide, actually, I'm really interested in how this particular area has been built. You can look into things like product management, which does take a bit of time to get into. But even before getting to product management, and actually project management are both very similar, although they would probably say otherwise. But you have things like user research, you have things like product design. So this is the step even before going into product where you're working closely with users to identify what their pain points are. And then this person kind of works between the customers and the internal product teams to understand, what are the different user journeys that will ultimately go into the product. So I think these type of roles are always a nice kind of first, stepping stone into the world. If you really want to get into tech, you're really interested in product, but don't have that product background. So one of my old team members who was a talent recruiter actually recently secured her first job as a junior user researcher in a music tech hardware company, which is totally different of what she's been doing for a long time. But, goes to show it is doable with, the right, passion, dedicating some time into your portfolio or your CV can definitely help you get there.
So that's actually great. So that example, how did she do that? I presume she worked on her portfolio in her spare time?
Yeah, really good question. So I think this is also a really crucial part for those of you out there who decide, okay, I want to go to product, but you have zero product background and knowledge. And as a recruiter, you're going to look at that CV and go, what? Why are you even applying for this role?
Yeah. Mhm.
But what she did really well was in one of our core projects, as we were working on technical hiring, was we had to build a microsite. Like, and we can look at it even from recruiting. We have systems that we need to use. So she actually reworded her CV to say, I worked on this microsite, we had this HRS migration, and then she worded it as like a product build. Our customers were internal teams. So actually reframing the projects that she was working on to make it sound like she's already in that space already. Because, you as a hiring manager who are only thinking about product and users, you can then relay the projects that you've been currently working on or worked on in the past to make it sound like you're already a user researcher. So she did a lot of work on that, on rewriting her CV. At the same time, she also did some like self-learning courses. And I think this is also really crucial. If you're interested in the space, like find some books about it. There's a lot of online resources as well. So being able to demonstrate that you are self-learning, not just saying, okay, I want to do this, but have zero effort or initiative. You also need to demonstrate to the team that you are taking the initiative to learn new skills. So in combination of that and really preparing for every single interview stage. She did say the final interview, which was more task-based, was very, very grueling, but I think she was able to, I guess, shine through that this is what she's very passionate about, and she got it. So I think
Great.
that's the crucial thing, is rewording all your projects to date, and don't assume the hiring manager already knows, you working on this project, what makes you a project manager or product manager.
So that's a great point. So I think that advice would be valid to almost anyone. But imagine that you're already quite experienced. You've had, you work for 5 to 8 years, let's say, in a different sector, but then you want to switch into tech. So I know it depends on exactly what you've done, right? Because if you're a teacher, that might be harder, right? But if you've done maybe a similar role, I don't know, maybe you work in FMCG or in automotive industry, how do you make that switch? What would be the first steps that you would take to make that switch?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Actually, also reminds me, another friend's partner actually moved from a teacher to work for an ed tech platform as a product manager. So, again, similarly, he was able to, because he knew, I guess, the problems and challenges that teachers were facing coming from a teacher background, and then applying to a tech company, he already could contribute, to the main challenges that they were facing. I think if you're in a really senior role, it is a little bit trickier, right? But you got to do your research to figure out what you want to move into. Let's say you're coming from FMCG or consultancy, and you want to move to an account management role or a social media role, or in our case, we're talking about user research. Again, trying to find specific projects that you're able to directly translate into that particular role. Because I don't think, and especially I think in startups, if you're applying for tech startups or SMEs, they're a bit more open. They're a bit more open to people from different backgrounds, because they appreciate it is tricky to hire, so they're a bit more open. So if you're able to demonstrate transferable skills, I think it would definitely benefit your application.
Yeah, I think it's harder in a really large organization when you have really strictly defined positions, and it's not impossible. It's just it will be a little bit harder.
Yeah.
Yes, and what in terms of how do you even find out about these opportunities? Because let's say you want to move to a role in tech, if you just apply from seeing a job on LinkedIn, I'm not saying you won't ever get an interview, but it will be a lot harder, right? Because if you don't have that relevant industry experience, I can't tell you how many times I was recruiting for a position, and the hiring manager was very specific. They just want someone from another software company. They just want someone with e-commerce experience. Just to give you one example, I was recruiting at King for a brand director, and I had over 200 applications. And I had to reject people from Google and PayPal because they didn't have the gaming experience, so it was really challenging. And then there was another role when at Expedia, finance manager or finance director, actually, and the hiring manager really wanted e-commerce background. And I remember before I even started doing sourcing, I had 176 applications and just 3 had the e-commerce experience, right? So I think especially when it's competitive, hiring managers obviously just can be a lot more picky than they are potentially normally. So what would be your advice in terms of how do you maybe do these informational interviews? How do you get in contact with people to even just get some information on how things work in a specific industry, in a specific company?
Yeah, I see your point, and I think especially when you're like very industry specific verticals, and
Yes.
you're at a stage where you're going out of seed and you're moving to the next stage. You really need someone who has had that experience building business, or at least that certain vertical, to give us the direct like for like knowledge. Because as a startup, I think you hire a lot of people and you realize you need a different skill set at the next stage. And I think obviously you can't fit like a square peg into a round hole in that instance, right? Like I'm not going to sit here and say, yeah, like, make up your CV, because absolutely do not do that. But I suppose, that's where you got to be a bit more realistic, right? Like if you are, and you haven't had any experience in tech, and let's say you're like, okay, I'm going to go work for, a space tech company, then, that might be a little bit trickier. But definitely I think manage your expectations and be very realistic. Okay, I want to work in tech, but what are the different areas I could be interested in, and I could transfer my skills into? And I always say it's always really good. And you mentioned networking. For those of you that are, let's say you want to get into coding, or even like women in tech groups. So for us as women in tech, there's so many opportunities to network and go to meetups, especially those here in the UK. And actually, it's a global initiative as well. We have like Who Code, Women in Tech Network, and they're all free. Like you can just go and meet people. And typically, the speakers who are there are usually someone very notable. And at the same time, you can also, in these events, and you get virtual events, you can also be on social media talking about it, and that's a really great way to engage. And not only engage, but also to build your own personal brand. Because let's say a hiring manager goes, okay, like in your Expedia, circumstance, and might not be like for like, but let's say like there's two candidates and they're both very similar, and there's one that you go on their social media and they're like really heavily engaged in tech networks, and clearly retweeting some really notable speakers in this space, and like they're already kind of in that mindset. And I find a lot of companies, they tend to hire more for mindset. Of course, technical skills is great, but I think we always think technical skills can be taught, whereas actually your mindset can't.
Yeah,
So I think just kind of
absolutely.
showing that you've got that initiative and being able to get out there is super helpful. Hackathons as well is a great way
Yeah.
to meet new people.
And what's your view on what if you're a new graduate? You maybe you had a couple of internships, you really want to get into
Yeah,
tech. How do you even well, obviously you can research some different areas, right? Because people sometimes are not very specific. Like it's not enough to say I want to work in tech. Like what part of tech and
yeah.
what kind of function are you interested in? But what would be your advice for someone who has limited work experience and they want to work in tech? Like how can they get even like some experience, even if unpaid, in
Yeah.
what they want to do? So what would you recommend?
Yeah, and even internships are so competitive nowadays, right?
No, I think they
And like
always have.
last,
Yeah.
yeah, like last year we ran our internship scheme, and we had like similar to you over 200 applications, and they're all at this point when everyone's from a really like strong university, everyone's got similar grades. Like, how do you even pick them? But the standout ones we find, and actually, I guess also this relates to your question for those of them who haven't had any work experience, what can you do? I think Gen Z, and especially all the talent coming into the marketplace now, are essentially digital natives. You were kind of brought up with mobile phones and emails as a default. So I would like to think things like TikTok is pretty much on your main page. But I think this translates back into the skill set that a lot of organizations are now seeing. It's things like, we were talking about this earlier, like video editing. How do you actually condense information to short form content? Historically things were 1 hour long. Now it's like 30 seconds. And there's so many kind of different, really amazing projects and initiatives I've seen students do online. So that supplements their application. So it might be an interactive CV. It becomes a game. Then there's so many tech enabled tools now where I think versus, I guess, our
Yes,
times when we were interviewing, it's like plain CV and you got a portfolio.
of course.
Now you have like Canva for design, you have Wix and Squarespace for website design. You can like have a Figma for prototyping in 30 seconds. So, there's so many things that you just drag and drop without necessarily having to code from scratch that can really support your application. And I
Very
think
true.
if you are trying to go for a tech role, being able to demonstrate that you understand at least how to utilize the tech tools out there to help you support your application, I think will speak a mile. Yeah, and I think
Fantastic.
importantly, if you're applying for a tech like software engineering role, always have like side projects to share as well.
Oh
And
yeah,
that's
so
what you don't really need a work experience, because you might like leave the street tomorrow and be like, okay, this weather app's terrible, I'm going to build my own,
yeah,
right? And
yeah.
that's
No, no,
that's already
absolutely.
something you can show.
So no, that's really great advice. So last question for today. Have you actually hired someone from a non-technical background? I'm not necessarily saying your current role, because I think that's like super niche, but maybe at FT or in any other position.
Yeah, definitely at the FT. I think they were really incredible because also, and here's another note, I think for a lot of job seekers out there. So diversity and inclusion, of course, is a very, very big part of all of our recruiting agendas for last 3 or 4 years, and it's still going, which is great. So what that means is, most companies want to hire people from different backgrounds to bring a different perspective. So FT was really great at, we had a lovely lady, Julia, who was our receptionist, actually at the building, which was subcontracted, and she was coding in her own time. And then she ended up coming through to our IT service desk to work on a lot of end user work. And then she is now using the apprenticeship levy, which is, for anyone in the UK, a really also great way to look into potentially getting paid to study a degree, and it could be a computer science degree, and work at the same time. So she ended up being funded on that, and is actually on her way to become an actual, like a Python, like JavaScript engineer. So there's so many opportunities. And also internal hiring is also a really great way of looking at talent. So for those of you who might not have heard of that, is essentially like you go into maybe a larger organization, start off in a role that you're currently already comfortable doing, and then do lateral moves across to other departments, into tech. That is also another really successful way that we see a lot of talent moving into tech once you're ready.
I agree, and that might be easier because they already know you. You've proved yourself in your current position, and the chances are definitely higher than if you're just an external candidate. So, Christine, thank you so much for sharing all of this great information. So if you've enjoyed this video, please feel free to let us know in the comments. Please feel free to like and share the video. And thank you so much for watching. And I will see you soon on another video. Bye for now.